So yeah, my name's Peter Ballerstedt. I'm a forage agronomist. I'm a ruminant nutritionist by training, and I'm a human being that's interested in what can we do to help what we're faced with across the globe. So anybody that doesn't know, this is not how we judge hay. There's no tasting involved in a hay judging contest. But in fairness, I'm an advocate for what I'm training myself to call therapeutic carbohydrate reduction. I think that there's a lot of reasons to do that. We can talk about that. And ruminant animal agriculture. I think ruminant animal agriculture, all of agriculture is under assault, but particularly ruminant animals. And I've worked in forage agriculture for most of my adult life. And currently I work for a forage seed company, but I'm not here in any capacity representing that company. But just to let you know where I'm coming from, my training as an agronomist was in those sciences related to healthy soils and healthy plants. As a ruminant nutritionist, I learned about healthy animals. And we understand in agriculture that if you don't feed them properly, they're not going to be well, and you can't make that up with veterinary pharmaceuticals, and you can't hope to be profitable, and it's not in the interests of the animals to not manage them properly. So one of the things I try to advocate for, educate people on, is we've made tremendous progress in animal husbandry since the 70s. And when we look at human husbandry, not so much. And I just find that an interesting contrast. But then, like many people, I had my own personal experience. So in 2007, I was a 52-year-old balding, obese, pre-diabetic. And today I'm just balding. So we're not talking about a miracle here yet. But in that journey and reading people like Gary Taubes and Michael and Mary Dan Eads, and then later Nina Teicholz and so many others, I just learned so much and got kind of angry at a level, because the industries I've been trained to support and the people I know that are making their living that way have been vilified. They've been accused unjustly of any manner of things. And so when I started to understand the lack of science behind the position that allowed people to attack them, no, this can't stand. We have to find ways to educate a public that's been badly informed. The allusion to the Matrix, right? Neo was the hero, I think, and he was offered the choice of taking the blue pill and going back to life as he knew it, forget anything he had been introduced to, or he could take the red pill and he would learn even more. So we've all had our red pill moment, those of us who have been introduced to this information and seen their own lives transformed as a result. And I want to challenge people within this community of nutrition and clinical practice that I've been introduced to, and make sure that they see all of the aspects of this, because these are oftentimes people with no agricultural experience, and they can fall prey to repeating things that aren't well-founded. And so I want to protect their credibility in the medical side by helping them avoid some of the misstatements that come. Right? People say things that just aren't well-founded in agriculture as well, and it's too important for us to make progress. So that's kind of the role I now play, is introducing my tribes to each other. I have my agricultural group and tribe that I belong to, and then I have this nutrition group and tribe that I belong to. And unfortunately, certainly in the States, I don't think it's that different in Canada. We're trained as we go further and further in our training our area of expertise gets narrower and narrower until we know a great deal about a relatively narrow topic and we're trained not to step outside. We need to build bridges between all these different disciplines so that we can help tell a more coherent story, and in part so we can push back against the people that advocate against us, frankly. And for me, that's going to involve educating people about what's really happening in the world. And that comes by introducing people to the reality of a world where a significant number of people live in a reality where 1 egg a day for a pregnant woman, and while she's breastfeeding, will produce cognitive and scholastic performance differences in her child that we can measure years later. Where stunting, physical growth, cognitive development are restricted due to a lack of animal source food in their diet. And so this is part of the world that we live in, yet too much of the conversation for me seems to be driven by people from the affluent West. And it's like, how can we better push back against it? And I think one good way to do that, frankly, is to repeat this kind of information that's available. That this has been demonstrated. This is not speculation. Animal source food is essential in the diet of human beings for proper development and function, period, full stop. Now the question of how much, the question of what form, those are personal decisions, right? And so we can get to that. I have a long-standing interest in the maritime area, so it's a pleasure to be here. This, by the way, is not a marshmallow farm. But it's a very pretty picture of forage agriculture, I think. And I think forage agriculture has some real unique advantages that we're not good at telling about from the producer to the consumer side. And so again, how do we get better at conveying reality? I'm tired of the us and them. I'm tired of diet wars. I'm not interested in that, although I've already been talking about them and I'm training myself. You know, if what many people believe many people believe things that I don't think are founded, but if what they believe were in fact true, I'd be worried too. It's only reasonable. Okay, so I need to remember that as I try to interact with people. But I think this is a point that we should all agree on. The focus of any nutritional program ought to be achieving adequate essential nutrition for a human being. Now, I understand there's a long conversation that comes after that, but let's work where we are. So that statement. And then the metabolic health. I don't think people yet understand meaningful markers, not risk markers, but meaningful metrics. What can we test for and actually see illness? Not what can we test for, find a value, and then associate that with risk, and then manage to some number. We need to change that. And again, I'm not a medical doctor, so again, don't take anything I say as medical advice. But again, I also think it needs to then be put in the hands of people for them to make appropriate decisions. So much of this is a one-size-fits-all kind of an approach. So much of the information, such as it is, was gleaned from sick white men in America under poor methodology. And that's what's been driving nutritional recommendations for a couple generations now. And it's time to change. It really is. These were some changes that I recommended. We're now in the startup to the producing the 9th edition of the dietary guidelines for Americans. They come out every 5 years in the US. And so they were seeking public input. And there is an agreed upon system now for evaluating evidence used in recommendations. I hope that the Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee will use it. There's abundant evidence that they should remove limits on saturated fat consumption. There's abundant evidence that they should eliminate all language about dietary cholesterol being somehow harmful to health. They removed the recommendation, but they kept the text. So if you read it, you can still, so that needs to go. They need to remove limits on sodium consumption. They need to remove language portraying red meat as unhealthy. And they need to shift protein recommendations from total protein to essential amino acids. And I'll talk about that more in a bit. So those were my comments. I can only hope. The greatest wealth is health. I agree with Virgil. And again, the message that we have is that ruminant animal agriculture can lead to healthy soils as well as healthy people. And it is frankly the best form of agriculture that we have for doing that. And in saying that, I don't want to imply that we have to have an either or, and we'll get to that. This is an example of a concept that I got in soil fertility. Justus von Liebig was one of the first organic chemists, and he used this analogy in regards to plant nutrition. And the idea here is we've got a wooden barrel. It could be water or wine, depending on your preference. And it's made up of different length staves in the side. And so the volume of that barrel, how much water or wine it can hold, is going to be determined by the shortest stave. Yes? Okay. So in this case, phosphorus is limiting. Something's always limiting. You never achieve full potential in cropping systems, livestock systems, many systems. There's always something that's limiting. In this case, phosphorus is limiting plant growth. So, okay, I add some phosphorus. Okay, that stave gets longer, but now nitrogen becomes the limiting nutrient. And so on until I get to some point where it's no longer economic for me to try to adjust whatever that limiting factor is. Okay, so that's where I learned it from years ago. Don't want to think exactly how long ago that is now. I want to apply it to human health. So I'm convinced that the most limiting factor in human health across our population is excess insulin, chronically elevated insulin, hyperinsulinemia. And that comes from a number of factors: carbohydrate-based diets, insulin resistance, okay? And then we could look at other factors like protein deficiency. There's a number of things that we could imagine are also part of this. But until we address that most limiting factor, we really can't know anything about those others. And yet we have people who are confidently saying various things about these other factors, and I just have a hard time believing that we can see that signal when we've got a signal this big. You know, if we've got a signal, it's hard to separate that out of the data. And then you have papers like this, where this researcher is asking the question, is hyperinsulinemia the unifying theory of chronic diseases? And I call it the short stave. And you go down this list of cancer and circulatory disorders and gastrointestinal disorders and endocrine disorders and nervous system disorders and skeletal disorders and urinary disorders. And all of those diseases then listed are now plausibly linked to, associated with, or causally related to hyperinsulinemia. So we're reaching the point where you could say the majority of non-communicable diseases, the non-infectious, which are the biggest killer in the world today, far bigger than any of the infectious diseases, are now plausibly related to an inappropriate diet, one that leads to chronically elevated insulin and therefore could be treated by a lifestyle intervention to reduce insulin. It also says something about management that's based on ever increasing levels of exogenous insulin. That could get a little awkward. So and again, I'm not that kind of doctor. I advocate that ruminant animal agriculture is the truly sustainable form of agriculture. But it can be a combined cropping life, and in fact it is globally. Now, in America, perhaps in Canada as well, there's been kind of a specialization within agriculture so that the farmers got rid of the livestock and stayed in crops, or the farmers, stayed in livestock and stopped raising crops. But those systems are still integrated so that the potato waste gets fed to livestock. So now instead of doing that on the farm, one farm, it's now done through the system. I want people to understand in all this conversation that maybe the most practical thing we can do to improve the world is to improve our health. And I want people to put proper value on that, because there are people who don't, and they're arguing against this. Yeah, but what about the whataboutisms? And it's like, no. We're talking about decreasing the risk of me losing some part of my body due to diabetes. Stop. I don't care what you're talking about, what you think might happen based on your models that don't work 100 years from now. We're talking within the rest of my lifetime. Today, every day in America, 200 people have some part of their body cut off because of diabetes. Every 30 seconds, someone in the world loses a lower leg due to diabetes. Imagine that happening in various parts of the world. We know today that when people start on that process, their life expectancy is less than many who are diagnosed with cancers of various forms. So as we start to look at this, it becomes something that I become sometimes too passionate about, and that gets in the way. Again, the us and them, no, it's all us. But we've become so separated that consumers don't understand producers, and sometimes producers don't really understand consumers. And getting us talking with each other and learning from each other, we're all concerned about the same things. And everybody eats. And the metabolic illness figures are very comparable across both. So let's start finding some point where we could, find that common ground and learn how to better tell our stories and find support. We can't feed today's world without livestock agriculture in general and ruminant animal agriculture in particular. So people who advocate an alternative, it's just not possible, let alone the world that we've got 31 years away, the world of 2050. In order for us to meet the goals, we have to get better at it. We have to improve productivity and efficiency, not necessarily in North America or Europe, but globally. And so one of the things I'm advocating for is what I'm calling a ruminant revolution, getting people mobilized at various different levels and sectors to promote what we need to do to help that happen. And there's some great examples I could give. This is what UN projections are for 2050, going from 7.5 billion to 9+ billion people, that we have to double food production to feed that population, that we're going to have a 2/3 increase in the demand for animal source protein. And of course, we're not making more farmland. In fact, we're losing farmland. So how are we going to do that? Well, one part of this is going to be 40% of the food we produce now never gets eaten. So, okay, that's something that needs to be addressed. But then there's other things that need to be done. And again, it's not producing it in North America and just exporting it to feed everybody. Obviously, we have to help people develop farming systems for where they are. But part of the problem is we don't even understand the world we're talking about. And so here's just one very quick example, because you hear so much about we need to control population growth. So I just like to put this up here to say, okay, there are 2 billion children in the world today, 15 years and under, out of 7.5 billion or whatever the number is. Okay, so in 2100, it's predicted that we'll get to 10 billion. There's arguments, but okay, use that number. So how many of the 10 billion are going to be 15 years or under? Okay, so you've got 4 billion, 3 billion, or 2 billion is your choice. And the answer is 2 billion. Same number of children. Isn't that interesting? Everybody assumes the population growth is coming from more children. No, it's coming from old farts like me getting to be even older. Live into your 70s and 80s instead of dying in your 50s and 60s. Well, what impact does that have on society? On cultural issues, so when people are saying we need to curb population, what exactly are you proposing? Because it's not going to be more children. Are you saying that people in Africa and Asia should die sooner than they could? Is that really what you're saying? I don't think so. I don't think you mean that. But I think that you need to, so, okay. And this is a book I recommend if you haven't come across Hans Rosling. And this book, it was published posthumously by his son and daughter-in-law, Factfulness. And it's a really good book. And there's a point in there where he tells a personal story. He lived through this, and it's, for me, a powerful story of unintended consequences. And so anybody that reads that book gets to that point, I want to hear from them. So there's been a series of really great papers in the last 2 months that have come out, and I'm happy to share those with people. This is one gentleman that I've been fortunate enough to meet, and his paper, Animal Source Foods, Sustainability Problem or Malnutrition and Sustainability Solution? Question. Perspective matters. He's from Nigeria. He's working in Africa. The organization that he works with works globally. They're the kind of people that do the 1 egg a day intervention. And so his comment is the notion that raising livestock and consuming animal source foods, milk, dairy, meat, fish, eggs, is fundamentally incompatible with sustainable development is flawed. I'd use a different adjective, but that's him and it's his quote. So if somebody says that we need to be on plant-based diets, the simple truth is we already are. And maybe that's the problem. That the majority of calories in humanity's diet are coming from plants, not from animal source foods. And globally, the majority of protein in humanity's diet is coming from plants, not from animal source foods. So if I'm getting energy from a food, it can either come from carbohydrate or fat, that's primarily. And if I'm eating plants, it's coming from sugars or starches. And those have a different metabolic effect on a human being than eating fat from animal sources. So we're on these high carbohydrate diets, which we're told we're supposed to be eating, and yet there's evidence that there's real problems. And this is just an example. Now, you know, this is their quote, but basically only 1/3 of humanity is eating a balanced diet. Now we need to dig into that, and I think they're missing some things that I'd like to work with them to gain or change my understanding, but we still have some differences in there. But look at the big orange shaded, you know, basically that other at least 1/3, and that's stunting. That's a lack of proper development. And that's 11% of GDP drag on Africa and Asia as we talk about sustainable growth and development. Healthcare costs for obesity, they peg a figure at what, $2 trillion? I think that's low. because I have a study that proposes 1.7 some trillion dollars for that just in the United States. That's 9.3% of GDP equivalent in the United States. So I think that maybe we've got differences in what they're looking at to come up with the numbers, because clearly if the 1.7 trillion is right for the United States, it's got to be bigger than 2 globally. And again, this is now a global phenomenon. The rate of obesity, for example, in South Africa is equal or greater than it is in the United States. And this is part of the problem that we frequently treat protein as if it's equivalent when it comes from plant sources and animal sources. So we lump it all together and talk about grams of protein, not acknowledging or understanding that protein, stated that way, is crude protein. And we determine crude protein by determining the nitrogen content expressed as a percentage multiplied by 6.25 to convert it into crude protein. This is a system that started in the 1860s. We're still using it. It's been modified over time. The assumption for that modification is all the nitrogen that was in that foodstuff was in protein, and all that protein was 16% nitrogen. That's how we get that modification. Well, in animal-sourced foods, the error isn't as great as it is in plant-sourced foods, because a lot of the nitrogen that's in plant-sourced foods can be in non-protein nitrogen forms. And it varies based on which one. Okay, but a ruminant can utilize non-protein nitrogen because the microbes in its rumen can capture that and form microbial protein out of it that the host organism can then digest. So there's no essential amino acid in ruminant nutrition, but there are in monogastric, like us, nutrition. So very different situation, yet we don't acknowledge that difference. So being of the person that, you know, my perspective, I adjusted down those values of the green bars by a value. I can justify it. It's not the best way to do it. It would be best if I could go into the data and say, well, so much of that was from cereals, and on average, those cereals are this, and then I just did a across-the-board adjustment. And now we can begin to look at how much protein, on average, humans are ingesting per day in these different areas. And even in the United States, we're looking at 50 some grams of animal source protein per day. And that might be 2/3 of what we should be getting. So there's a better conversation that we need to be having. And certainly globally, many people are not close to achieving what they should be getting. And then you may have heard something called Eat Lancet, came out the beginning of this year, and they had their proposal for a global diet. I just drew the line across the graph. That's what they're recommending. That's the intake level from meat that they're recommending. Yeah, I don't think so. But when we start to accurately look at nutritional value of foods and compare plant sources to animal sources on that kind of essential basis, we find that these environmental impacts get very close. You know, everything we do impacts the environment, but the differences get much less when we start to accurately represent the nutritional value. Good morning.
Good morning. How are you, sir?
I'm well, and you?
I'm also well. I'm sorry to interrupt. And
not at all. Glad you came. I won't go back and start over. So, but just continuing with this idea of, you know, no, you may sit there, please. And there's coffee back on the bar if you'd like. How many calories are there per gram of carbohydrate? Remember, anybody know? 4 calories per gram for carbohydrate, 4 for protein, 9 for fat, right? I mean, that's a rule of thumb. You should pardon me for using that expression. Yeah, well, there are 4 kcals per gram of sawdust, because that's a gross energy value. And in animal science, for many years now, we have recognized that there's gross energy, then there's digestible energy, right? Some of that is indigestible, and then you've got a digestible bit, and then some of that is not metabolizable. So we work at least on the metabolizable energy level, and human nutrition doesn't. That could be significant. You know, if only 75% of the total gross energy in the food that we're consuming is in fact metabolizable, we may think we're eating 2,000 calories a day and we're only getting 1,500. And then we compare that to an animal source-based diet where we're eating 2,000 calories and we're getting much closer to 2,000 calories out of it because much more of that is metabolizable. Okay, enough. Basic ecology, we're heterotrophic organisms. We have to consume some other organism in order to get what we need, right? We can't just go out and photosynthesize. We can't, harvest the energy of the cosmos directly. Clearly, this is all based on photosynthesis, the conversion of CO2 via photosynthesis with water to produce carbohydrate and oxygen. And then organisms like cattle will eat things like that crimson clover, and some portion of that reduced that carbohydrate is then going to be emitted as methane. They'll respire some CO2 as well, but the primary gas that people are concerned about is methane. That methane will be oxidized back to CO2 within about 10 years. So we have this cycling of CO2 within the environment as opposed to an enrichment, which happens when we burn fossil fuels, for example. So very different situation. I understand that not everybody is comfortable with evolution, and I mean no disrespect. For me, it's important because I think it should guide what kinds of foods we ought to be basing our diets on. I just found this interesting. Grass is a very old organism. Almost makes it back to the dinosaurs. Not quite, apparently, but pretty close. So we have evidence from fossil records. Ruminant ancestor is 50 million years ago. That's just pretty remarkable. So there's evidence of the rumination and rumen flora being present 40 million years ago. And then essentially the 6 existing ruminant families were present 25 million years ago, 20 million years ago, somewhere in that range. And then later, we had some shifts that occurred. That green bar that's called C4 biomass expansion. CO2 levels had dropped so low, plant growth was inhibited. And this new photosynthetic pathway emerged, however that happened, and it could flourish under those low CO2 conditions. And also those plants tend to be more drought tolerant than our C3 older varieties. And so these plants were favored. They expanded. The forests were retreating. The grasslands were expanding. The ruminants then were there to utilize that. And then we have the hominid ancestor showing up, and then we have the modern human beings showing up, utilizing that resource, exploiting those resources. A researcher that I've just recently come across, Dr. Jess Thompson, gave this presentation. You can find it on YouTube. Very, very interesting, for me at least. And there is a theory that her research is supporting, so I don't want to make it seem like it's hers alone. But it used to be thought that eating meat, which again would be protein and fat, but meat eating was this thing that drove our evolution. And there are people who are suggesting, no, it was specifically consuming things like bone marrow, fat primarily, with a bit of protein in it, but it's nowhere near what muscle meat is. And she then, we have people who are trying to say, well, what is uniquely human when we look across primates? And people will say language. And it's like, well, language occurs across a spectrum. Yes, we have, done something with it that others haven't, but other primates communicate. So what's that? Or it's tool use, and that one's even more, no, we have evidence of other primates using tools. Now, yeah, we get more complex tools, but okay, for her and others, and this was her paper, the origins of the human predatory pattern, that we uniquely among primates routinely take down and consume animals our size and bigger. The other primates that eat meat, it's usually smaller, leaner, occasional, and we're doing this all the time throughout the record. So that then ties into, I believe her name was Aiello, was the researcher that proposed what's called the expensive gut hypothesis. That as we consume this higher, to complete this story, we have the Australopithecus Lucy utilizing hammerstones to crush open the husks of nuts or something. Okay, so it's a short step from that to use the same tool to now open a long bone and access the marrow that's in it at a time when we are scavenging, or they are scavenging, kills of carnivores. And I think she says that hyenas were the only other organism in that environment, or the hyena ancestor, that was crushing bones to get at that. And so now we have the plausible story of Lucy and her kind accessing marrow and brain, which also tend to be protected in the environment. They don't spoil as quickly as muscle meat until the bone is broken. So that's interesting. And she has a quote about, and this apparently is fossilized marrow that they discovered at one of these sites within the bone. And she describes it like finding a stick of butter on a landscape devoid of fat. I just like that image. And so Rudyard Kipling, I don't know if you're familiar with the Just So stories. This one was the cat that walked by himself. And it's his allegory of animal domestication. Somewhere along the line, our ancestors figured out that certain animals could be partners in our process. And so now this is after the domestication of the dog, which was first, and then the horse, which was second. It's a wonderful story because, of course, first the man has to take woman into his cave, who begins domesticating him, which, okay. So now we have wife talking to the woman, talking to the man. And the woman is saying, her name is not Wild Cow anymore, but the giver of good food. She will give us the warm white milk for always and always and always, and I will take care of her while you and the first friend and the first servant go hunting. I just like the story. And it actually is pretty close. I think there's maybe some evidence that domestication of ruminants might have come a little before the horse, but it's all happening at about the same time. And what's also interesting is there are changes in how we produce food globally in widely separated populations that have no contact with each other at about the same time. Something happened globally that favored that, and that's another conversation for another day. Again, we have two groups of mammals here, and the question is which group of mammals is designed to digest a low-fat diet. So group A is the sheep, the cow, and the gorilla. And then group B is modern human beings, lions and polar bears. And it's a trick question because neither of them is designed to digest a low-fat diet. There's a difference between digest and ingest. What we eat is not what we absorb. And with the cow, with the ruminants, we're talking about a diet that has to be less than 6% crude fat total. If you put too much fat in, it inhibits the microbial activity. And so it's very low fat, high fiber, but 70 to 80% of a cow's energy ends up coming from fatty acids that were produced by the microbes degrading the fiber. Now, we don't have rumens. We don't have those specialized structures that allow for the exploitation of high fiber, low protein, and low protein quality diets that the ruminants do. So we do a comparison schematically of digestive systems between a monogastric, like pigs, chickens, rats, man, sorry, but there it is, or ruminants, which, deer and sheep and goats and cattle and bison and moose and reindeer and all these organisms. And we're familiar with macronutrients, so carbohydrate, fat, and protein, those are part of our diet. They flow into our acidic stomach with some enzymatic activity, and following that, they go into the small intestine where more enzymes break them down into smaller components, which we then absorb, like amino acids and sugars and fatty acids and minerals and vitamins. With the ruminant, we plug in this big anaerobic fermentation fat in front of the acidic stomach. And then there's some processes in between those because we have to remove some of the water from what flows out of the rumen. So that, in a nutshell, is the ruminant's digestive system. And again, these are organisms that develop the ability to eat various plant materials. Some are grazers, some are browsers. And there's differences physiologically or morphologically in their mouths and in their digestive system. But basically, it's this utilization of this feed resource to then give them what they need, which is very similar to what we need, except that we go about it very differently. Okay. Again, 4 stomachs, mentioned that, ruminants. But here's the sort of ecological niche between that for humans, there is such a thing as essential amino acids. Talked about that a little bit. There's no such thing as an essential amino acid in a ruminant's diet. Again, because the microbes can take non-protein nitrogen and convert it into microbial protein that the host animal then digests, like we would digest fish or hamburger or something that we eat. There's essential fatty acids that we have that are essential in our diet. We must consume them. We can't make them. There's no such thing, apparently, as an essential fatty acid in a ruminant's diet. Factually speaking, there's no such thing as an essential carbohydrate in the human diet. And there are 2 forms that are essential in a ruminant's diet. You have to give a ruminant both structural and non-structural carbohydrate. You have to give them fiber as well as sugars or starches or other non-fibrous carbohydrate in order for that rumen to function properly. It's a little awkward that we're told that 60+% of our calories need to be coming from something that isn't essential to us. I find that interesting. So there are these essential ecological functions that I list for ruminants. And the amazing thing is, in all of the ecosystems that humans have successfully, to use the word, colonized, they have a domesticated ruminant that is part of their experience there. And domestication can look a little different, but I mean, they're managing wildlife at a minimum for their own use. They're using fire to manipulate the feed resource, and that also then directs animals. So there's lots of those things going on. They convert, again, the structural they turn carbohydrates into fat for us instead of us, I guess is the short version of that. They convert plant protein, which really isn't protein, and the non-protein nitrogen, into highest quality animal protein for us. They reduce unstable polyunsaturated fatty acids into more stable mono and fully saturated fatty acids through this process, because apparently those polyunsaturated fatty acids are toxic to the rumen organisms. And so they have a biological defense for it. They produce vitamin B12, other vitamins. B12 can only be supplied through animal source foods. Doesn't have to be ruminants, but it can only be supplied. You can't supplement for a lack. And that, again, is part of that work that's been done demonstrating this. Increased bioavailability of essential nutrients. Just because it says there's so much iron in the spinach doesn't mean we can absorb it. And so because of the process, livestock increase that bioavailability. They decrease anti-quality components. Again, there are components in plants that interfere with our absorption of essential nutrients, as well as some other effects. They maintain health of grassland ecosystems, which are our largest biomes. And we're coming to understand how important grassland is for soil health, for watershed health, for surface water quality. They recycle nutrients, build soil health, provide services like draft, of other byproducts. Half of the farmers in the world still depend on draft animals, a large number of which are ruminants. So when people propose getting rid of livestock, oh, they're going to drive tractors now? You know, it's half of the world's fertilizer comes from manure. So where's your fertilizer going to come from to grow those crops that you're saying we should just eat now? They don't think these things through, and then they generate new wealth. The provision of a means of creating new wealth, to build wealth, to allow people to advance, is a significant component of global livestock agriculture. And when people talk about getting rid of it, you're talking about a large number of some of the poorest people in the world. Their food security and their economic security is dependent on livestock agriculture. They're pastoralists, they're herders. What are you proposing we change? The Earth's surface is finite, but if we start to look at it, obviously the majority of the Earth's surface is water. Only 4%, and actually I've seen more current figures, it's down closer to 3%, is suitable for cultivation. We're richly blessed in North America with cropland. Now, many people who would argue with me conflate cropland with agricultural land. And then they say, look at how much agricultural land livestock use as if it's getting chewed up and destroyed. And what they're not admitting or understanding is that only, cropland and agricultural land are not synonymous terms. Cropland is a portion of agricultural land. Yes? So, something like 14% of the Earth's surface is rangeland, land that should never be cultivated. It's what's left over from our exploitation and development, because most of our most productive cropland was originally grassland. And I would argue a significant amount of that could go back into being grassland, and we'd be better off for it. 10% is forest, and there are people doing wonderful work around the world on agroforestry, silvopastoral systems, trees and grass and crops, all within some kind of a system. And again, it's a good story that we're not good at telling. There's only so many things you can do to produce food from land. And the three that I've come up with here is we can grow the grain, oilseed, fruit, and vegetable crops. That would have to come on the cropland. On the rangeland or other parts of agricultural land, we can have pasture or range. And then we could also have, maybe on more of our more productive land, we could grow forage crops that we could harvest for hay, things like that. Okay. Clearly the last two aren't going to produce food directly for us to use, but they're going to produce feed that can go to ruminants. Okay. And the product of the first category will produce something we can eat. What's not well appreciated is it also produces a lot of waste product. So we talked earlier about feeding potato waste to livestock. And you could think brewing waste going into livestock production. And you can think of off-grade grains that aren't suitable for human consumption, but are suitable as a feed grade. And so you have all that kind, as well as some of the plant residues. So you grow a corn crop, you've got stalk and husks and things left over that are also suitable as livestock feed, not just the corn itself. Talked already about non-protein nitrogen. And I just make the point that ruminants provide essential nutrition. That these other products from crop agriculture aren't producing sufficient essential nutrients by themselves. I'm not saying that they don't have a role or a place, but you can't meet your essential nutrition needs by eating plant-only diet. It's just not possible. Another part that isn't well understood or talked about is this nutrient flow then. So we're good in some parts of the world at capturing livestock manures and getting them sequestered so they don't impact surface waters or leach, and then can be utilized to grow succeeding crops. So cycling them on the farm. But once it leaves the farm, what happens? Once it gets to the city, what happens to those nutrients? And animal source foods remove less nutrient from the soil than the livestock products that you could produce on that same area. Plus, they're a richer source of nutrition, so you need to eat less to get the same amount of nutrition. So you kind of win on both cases there. And there's some conversations that, because we're in mixed company, I just won't go into on the whole matter of human waste and related issues. This is from 1999, and this was an estimate then of the use of the world cereal crop. And in 1999, almost 2/3 was already going to humans directly. So when people say, if we got rid of livestock agriculture, look at all the feed that they eat that we could now feed everybody with. It's like, well, you've only got 1/3 to play with. And that's not going to be enough.
Are those figures still true today?
They've changed a little bit. This is 2018. And I'm sorry. Okay, sorry. I'll get to there.
Yeah, sorry, I didn't need to.
No. Yeah, no, again, it's the sort of stuff that I know that, like, people go, what? No, wait. It's sort of a test to see if people are listening at times. Like, did you hear what I just said? So I very much appreciate it. This is the global feed, globally, the feed consumed by all of ruminant animals in agriculture, okay? Didn't express that quite as well as I wanted to. And you're looking at 5% maximum of that 5 billion tons of dry matter are potentially human edible. Now, some of us would argue that soy cakes may or may not be, just because you can doesn't mean you should, right? Okay. And then that grain slice that's 4%, 1/4 of that was off-grade grain. So while the grain was human utilizable, it wasn't of sufficient grade. So really, it's like 96% of all that 5 billion tons is not human edible. So when people talk about getting, so that kind of an investment then yields all that food of highest quality for us. And if you get rid of it, how do you replace that? So there's that impact. And that turns out to be 10% of global cereal production. That's it. I think that's a great deal. I think it's a wonderful exchange that we can take 10% of global cereal production, feed it through ruminants, and produce the food for us. So that, go ahead.
Can I ask what falls under what your criteria for a cereal is?
So wheat, corn, oats, barley. I think rye and triticale would come under there. I think sorghum comes under there as well.
I mean, that so contradicts the figures that I have found and read anywhere else.
Yeah.
About
Yeah. So this paper 2018 by Motet, I share. I'll send you the paper. Okay. Yeah, that's sort of my function in the world now, is to say, you know, I know of this, and if you'd like it, I can help you connect to it. So this is the key thing about ruminant animals, that they contribute directly to global feed security. They rely on grazing and forages. They need only 0.6 of a kilo of human edible protein to make a kilo of human edible protein that's of much higher nutritive value. So they're not just increasing the food supply, they're improving the food quality, as well as the other services. And this idea, I've got beard envy here. But when our soils are gone, we too must go, unless we find some way to feed on raw rock. I got to visit North Dakota and got introduced to a state fertility extension specialist. And in the United States in the 60s and 70s, they had a massive effort to map all the soils in the United States. So you can, wherever you are, you can go find what soils you're on, and they're characterized, and yield potential and all that kind of information is available. So they can go back to the same place that they characterized a soil in 1960, because that's all recorded. They can go there today. We talk about soils as having horizons, with the A being the top, and then B, and then C, and then C is above the parent material, essentially. That same soil today, the top of the sea horizon is 18 inches closer to the soil surface than it was in 1960. And that's wind erosion, that's water erosion, that's organic matter oxidation, all of that leading to, so there's no more A horizon. What's left is they've created an AB. They've mixed the two together with tillage. And there are areas where in North Dakota, you don't build stone walls when you clear the fields. You just make piles, and then you farm around the piles. And so now they have these pedestals of soil underneath. And there's a pile of rocks, and the soil underneath was protected, and now there's the surface that they're farming. And if we're not talking about that in sustainability conversations, we're not having an honest conversation. And cropping necessarily negatively impacts the soil. We can do things to minimize that, but it's sort of a given. If you're going to till the soil, you're going to degrade soil health. And again, I didn't do it for PEI. I suspect that Kentucky is bigger than PEI. But I mean,
familiar picture,
yeah. Yeah. So imagine losing 6 inches of topsoil the size of the state of Kentucky every single year. And it takes thousands of years to make an inch. If we're not I mean, there are real problems and we need to get on them, but we're being distracted by things that I don't think are worth our time. This is a rainfall demonstrator. There's a big effort on soil health in the United States. I suspect it's happening here, but, and we've got this, just out of the top of the picture, there's an oscillating sprinkler, okay? And they went out into fields and they got surface samples for a conventional tilled field on, closest to us, and then overgrazed pasture, well-managed pasture, and cover crop. And then they start the water, and so what's going to be collected in the jars is the water that runs off the surface. So in the time it took to collect a gallon's worth of heavily laden, muddy water off of the first two, none ran off of the pasture. And we got a third of a gallon coming off of the cover crop. Now, cover crop is this idea that after we've harvested the principal crop, we're going to try to have something else growing to protect the soil from rainfall impact, to hold the soil in place, other benefits. So with all the good that can be said about cover crop, it's not as good as well-managed pasture at improving infiltration. Now, well-managed was a key phrase because poorly managed pasture is as bad as conventional tillage. So management is a key part of this, and we have to get people doing that better. This was an example of something that I got to witness in south central Nebraska. And what's happened here is the technician on this side of the slide has just dropped in we soil scientists would call it a PED. Most people would call it a clod. She's dropped a PED of soil from grassland long-term into that water column right next to her. So these are full water columns with a wire basket at the top. And the basket's low enough so the PED will be completely submerged. She had already dropped one from the same soil type, the other side of the fence, but it was from long-term conventional continuous corn, but the same soil type. And so she dropped that in first, and then the one from the grassland. 25 minutes later, you see the other picture. And most of the PED from the grassland remains intact up in the basket. The water column is clear. The other PED has dissolved, essentially. It just broke down. It didn't dissolve, really. It just lost all its structure. It had no water-stable structure. So a soil like that one, when you start getting high rainfall events, seals, and you get more water running off. You get less oxygen infiltrating into the soil, so it's not as conducive to biological activity, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. You're going to have poorer water quality in the watersheds that's a part of. Meanwhile, grass produces the effect in the other column. Again, grass is a unique organism. The oldest part of the grass is the tip of the leaf versus trees or other plants where those growing points are out at the end. Alfalfa even, the growing points are at the end. With grass, the growing points are at the base. They evolved under fire and grazing. That's their survival mechanism. But the very benefit for us is that each grass differs, but if we can find that optimal rest period between defoliations, whether we're cutting it or whether we're grazing it, the roots will grow the same amount as if we hadn't grazed it at all. So we can utilize it and still get all the benefits if we apply the right management. Or conversely, if we cut it too frequently, we can also see what happens. So much is said about greenhouse gas emissions. We just need to acknowledge they're not alchemists. They're not creating carbon. They're not creating nitrogen. They're part of a cycle. And that cycle carries on whether they're there or not. Okay, I talked before about the CO2 into carbohydrate, into the animal, out some portion as methane, but it gets oxidized back to methane, CO2 in about 10 years. So that cycling takes place as opposed to systems that require more fossil fuel input, because then we're putting new CO2 into, new in quotes, into the atmosphere. And if anyone says that cattle produce more emissions than all of transportation, they're citing a report that was retracted. And it was retracted some time ago. And this now is these are figures from our EPA under a previous administration that are stating that all of agriculture is 9% of anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions in the United States. 9% total, all ag. All of livestock agriculture is 4%, which implies to me that it's a lower amount than plant agriculture, right? Because 9 minus 4, never mind. And beef is 2. Okay, so that's interesting. We can look at these methane enteric from the fermentation process, methane emissions, broken out by US industrialized nations and then the developing world. And we can see that United States emissions have been static since 1961. So if we got rid of that, how would that move the needle? When we have the developing countries, and so are we saying that we should stop them from, well, what's the impact of that? And in fact, if we look at global livestock emissions are like 14.5 of the global. Now, there's a lot to say there, but let's just leave that. The beef cattle production globally is 6%. Again, we're now talking globally. The US beef production is 0.47% of global. Or another way to put that is that we're 8% of global beef cattle emissions are the United States. Okay? In the United States, we've got about 9% of the world's cattle, and we produce 19% of the world's beef. And it's producing 8% of the global beef emissions. To do that, that's the efficiency. That's what we've been able to achieve. So maybe it would be better if we could help other people improve their efficiency. And there's ways that we could talk about that. If I double beef consumption in the United States, the life cycle emissions from that would be less than the tailpipe emissions alone from driving 2,700 miles in a car that averages 25 miles per gallon, or flying nonstop from New York to LAX via Denver, round trip. So I'm comparing all the emissions from everything it takes to produce that beef to just the fuel exhaust from the transportation. It gets to a point where what are we even talking about here? We can't really be serious here. The numbers are just so out of line with what people believe is true. So let's say we got rid of all animal agriculture in the United States. This study was done. I do need to point out that they mean to get rid of pets too. Okay, but they're smart enough not to say that at first. Because that, we've got 9 million dairy cattle in the United States. We've got 9.5 million horses. Yeah, they have an environmental impact, but nobody talks about that, do they? Well, it might be that would hurt funding, because the wealthy suburbanites that want their horses might not like people talking about it. No, maybe it's just me. So, costs and benefits to anything we do. Potential benefit is if we got rid of all livestock, including those other animals, we would reduce US greenhouse gas emissions by 2.6%. It's not nothing. Globally, it's less than 0.4%. That might be measurement error, but there's a cost. These are the costs they listed: unbalanced food ecosystem, creating essential dietary nutrient deficiency. So, cost and benefit. Not good at weighing those. Study done upper Midwest, 4 years of data, soil carbon increase. They compared specific grazing management protocol. They looked at, how are we doing? Yeah. Okay. They looked at a grass finishing and compared it to a conventional feedlot finishing system. And what they found was, and it should not be surprising, but it often is, that the emissions under the feedlot finishing were less than under the grass finishing system. That's just how the digestive system works. But what they found was this significant carbon sequestration that took place in the soil under their grazing management, and that was enough to more than offset the emissions from the grass finishing system. Okay, so that bit, I would just want to point out that one, this was on ground that had been cropped previously, and so the organic matter level had been depleted, and organic matter level in a soil establishes an equilibrium that's governed by a number of things, soil type, environment, things like that. So it's not just going to keep going up and up and up. At some point it'll level off. So you won't see that big increase. Okay. But then on top of that, 3/4 at least of a steer's life is going to be spent on grass if it goes to a feedlot. And so if you applied that grazing management that they did throughout the entire lifespan, now you've got all that time. We're not just looking at I think we're getting really close to being able to say that beef, regardless of how it's finished, under these carbon neutral to negative. Now I'm going to tread dangerously here into the pharmacy thing, but part of our challenge is we have people who have worldviews and mindsets. They can only see things a certain way. Any number of reasons, don't want to impute motives. This was a tweet out of the Lancet, and they were saying, look, half of the people worldwide who need insulin to treat type 2 diabetes will not receive it in 2030 unless access is improved. If all you've got is a hammer, everything looks like a nail, right? That's all they know how to do is, we got to get them insulin. They got, and my question would be, if only there were some way that we could reverse type 2 is there another approach maybe to deal with type 2 diabetes besides insulin? Maybe, what could that possibly be? And one of the reasons we need to look at this is that the pharmaceutical industry is a high emitting industry. They are a more intensive emitter than the automotive industry, and we just don't talk about it.
Can you expand on what you mean by that?
For this study, what they did was they said, for the value of the product produced, you're emitting this much greenhouse gas, as well as in other studies, they talk about other discharges to the environment. And so then if we start looking at the greenhouse gas impact of moving to lower meat diet, it's offset by the pharmaceutical use. So if the average American type 2 diabetic could eliminate their medications, they'd reduce their carbon footprint 29% more than if they switched from a meat heavy to a vegan diet. And we know that we have sustainable dietary lifestyle interventions versus we know that vegan diets are not sustainable in the sense of people staying on, let alone any other environmental or health impacts. If there were only some way that we could get type 2 diabetics to reduce or eliminate their medication, what could that possibly be? If only there were some way. Well, yeah, okay. So this is VERTA data. This is demonstrating medication use reduction in a group of type 2 diabetics within a couple months. I think it was a year long that they looked at, but again, this happens very quickly, and it must under supervision. Again, I'm not a medical. And in other countries, 5% of all road traffic is now caused by the National Health Service in England. And so they're now saying we have to find a way for remote counseling. Well, maybe there's another bit of that too. Maybe there's a way to reduce the burden of chronic disease. In the United States, over half of adult Americans now have diabetes or prediabetes. 60% of adult Americans have one or more chronic diseases. And we heard earlier that just around 12% of adult Americans enjoy optimal metabolic health. That's how bad it's gotten. And so all of that is a burden. All of that has a footprint, if you will. And sometimes I just get maybe too snarky for my own good. But yeah, the healthcare industry, per some analyses, is projected to have 10% of total greenhouse gas emissions in the United States. Now, in fairness to that data, it's not the same kind of analysis. So the 2% for beef is coming from life cycle analyses, and the healthcare would include the food that's served, the energy that's used to keep the hospitals open, and whereas the life cycle has a different methodology. So rather than make that direct comparison, it's fair to say that healthcare itself has an environmental impact. And we haven't done much to quantify that, let alone discuss it. And again, the point is that if chronic disease is driving our problem with healthcare, then methods that are demonstrated to positively impact that need to be counted as we go cost and benefit analysis for environmental conversations. An aspirational goal of mine, and I think anyone, is that striving against the generation and propagation of unnecessary human suffering and pain. Humans are going to suffer, it's part of life. We're going to experience pain, that's part of life. But the unnecessary stuff, and I would contend that we have people who are suffering unnecessarily. And right now it can best be ascribed to ignorance. They don't know of effective interventions or information. Death is inevitable, but a life of protracted ill health is not. Chronic disease prevention and control helps people to live longer and healthier lives. It's really tricky for us to say we know how to eat or do anything to avoid chronic disease. I know people have been saying that for decades. We really don't know. We don't have the ability to do those kinds of studies, nor should we. Moral issues are here. But I think we do have confidence for a number of conditions once they appear of what would be appropriate to minimize or potentially reverse. And then you could say, well, if it can do that, then maybe, well, yeah, maybe, I don't know. But we got into the trouble we're in because people made statements that I don't think the data supported at the time. And so we can't correct today's problems by making the same mistakes that got us here. That murdered another Einstein quote. There's this, there are a series of sustainable development goals that have been established by FAO and other organizations globally. And these are to do with nutrition specifically. There are others. And so this is what the world looks like today, where we have something like a quarter of children under 5 being stunted. And we have something like just under 8%, though, are wasting from a caloric lack, call it famine, what have you. We've got, at the same time, just under 6% that are overweight. We've got a third of women of childbearing age being anemic globally. And then we've got 13% of adults globally being obese. Now, unfortunately, the people doing the work to try to reverse those trends, they've set goals, they're trying to do this, but they're still under the influence of overeating and sedentary behavior drives overweight and obesity. And that obesity causes these metabolic diseases. right? Rather than obesity being a reflection of metabolic disease. Okay. I think that if we could get them to incorporate metabolic syndrome into this, we could get them to re-examine that mindset, and we could help them achieve all those goals. Plus, when you look at the data, it's hard to find these numbers. The 25% figure is based on diabetes rate times 3, which one paper suggested. Well, okay, there's problems with that, right? Because people are sick a long time before they're diagnosed with diabetes. I've talked to other people that give me a figure of more than 50% are metabolically ill. And if we could do that, we could achieve those goals that they've set. I think we could make enormous progress. So that's one of the things that I'd like to see happen. 2 billion people suffer from micronutrient deficiencies today. You know, we've got 800 million human beings that are suffering from caloric insufficiency. We've got 2.2 billion that are overweight or obese. 150 some million children under 5 suffer from stunting. Millions more with impaired cognitive development. Animal source foods supply multiple bioavailable nutrients that are lacking in the cereal-based diets of the poor. Cereal-based diets, those are the ones we're told to eat, right? That's awkward. You can plot frequency of stunting against meat consumption by country. And yeah, association doesn't prove causation, but there's a pretty good relationship there where the lowest levels of, it's probably not the only factor, but we're seeing the most stunting in the areas with the least meat consumption. And again, just for reference, this is where Eat Lancet wants us to be, in the high stunting rate range. So I don't think so. For us old farts, it's becoming clear that as we get older, we need more protein in our diet. And it must be high quality animal source protein because we get less efficient at utilizing it and maintaining lean muscle mass, which is really important. So this was a paper published last month. And this points again to this contamination that's in my literature because of what happened in nutrition. Okay, I just said the first point. Second, age-related muscle loss, major problem. We must do something. Increased ratio of animal-based protein to plant-based protein in the diet might mitigate that. So sounds like something to look for. And now my radar starts twitching. Now, animal-based protein sources, especially those that are lean or nutrient-dense, are the most anabolic per gram. Why are you saying that? Okay, we're talking about grams of protein, not grams of meat. Well, that leanness and nutrient density, you must understand, at least in the United States, in the dietary guideline, is explicitly low fat because they don't look at fat as a nutrient. So it can only dilute what they think are essential nutrients. Okay, yeah, I'm twitching a little bit. Now we get to this one. Additional health and environmental considerations are needed prior to what? Oh, what if there are no, what if your health concerns aren't well founded and what if the environmental issues have been overblown? Well, why do we feel the need to say this when the message itself is critical that people hear this? So in any case, quick review. Humans are heterotrophs. We have to consume other organisms. Something's got to die if we're going to live. It's just the way it is. Sorry. Animal products are superior sources of nutrition in the human diet. Ruminant animal agriculture offers unique ecological advantages over other forms of food production. We're not getting away from agriculture. We have to have it. There can be no sustainable agriculture without ruminants. Ruminants don't compete with humans for resources. I think that's a critical point people frequently miss. Ruminants increase the quality and quantity of humans' food supply in specific ways. Modern humans exist because of ruminants. Modern societies depend upon them, and they're going to be essential to the future of humanity, contrary to what people say. you know, it's impossible to go beyond ruminant animal agriculture. Sorry. Okay. Estimates of ruminant animal agriculture's environmental impact are typically overstated, oversimplified, and misleading. I think that's the kindest way I can put it. And again, if what people thought were true, I'd be concerned too, right? But I hope I can help people come to understand that they've been very poorly served by people who have a different interest. And they need to be aware of what that other interest might be so that they can, and the information this isn't stuff I made up. This is stuff that anyone in ruminant animal agriculture would have been taught or know from their own experience. It's just that we're so small now as a group, and we're not good at reaching a wider public. And so I need to work on their game while I hope I can help other people. So this is just how to contact me. And I have cards here with some contact information. So thanks for the opportunity. Thanks.